France's colonial policy in Africa. A historical overview. France, a dominant force in Africa for centuries, has left a significant mark on the continent's political, economic, and social development. The history of Africa, marked by dramatic shifts and upheavals, was profoundly shaped by colonialism, particularly the exploitation of its people and resources by European powers. The history of French colonialism in Africa is intertwined with the broader European imperialist endeavor, including the transatlantic slave trade, which had a devastating impact on the indigenous populations of Africa. In the 15th century, European powers began to penetrate tropical Africa, a movement that would continue for centuries. The early European incursions into Africa were initially motivated by the search for gold, slaves, and other resources. The transatlantic slave trade, which began in the 16th century, played a critical role in this colonization. Initially, Africans were captured and transported to Europe. However, by the 16th century, with the establishment of Spanish colonies in the West Indies, the trade shifted toward the Americas, where European colonies demanded cheap labor for sugar, tobacco, and cotton plantations. This increased demand led to the forced importation of African slaves, a trade in which France, alongside other European powers, became deeply involved. France's participation in the slave trade was particularly prominent in its Caribbean colonies. By the mid-17th century, France had become a rival to Great Britain in global colonial competition. French colonies such as Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, Martinique, and Guadeloupe grew to become major producers of sugar, coffee, and other commodities, with their economies dependent on the labor of African slaves. This colonial system allowed France to extract vast profits, which were funneled back to the metropolis, fueling its industrial development. The wealth generated from the exploitation of African labor did not remain confined to the colonies. The profits from the slave trade were reinvested into manufacturing, spurring the growth of factories and mills in France. The men who profited from the trade often rose to the highest levels of French society, their fortunes solidifying the role of slavery in the economic expansion of the West. This system of wealth accumulation, based on the systematic exploitation of African slaves, contributed to the rise of capitalist economies in Europe, although at an immense cost to Africa. Colonialism, which extended well beyond the era of the slave trade, was marked by the continued subjugation of African peoples. By the 19th century, European colonialism evolved from a system based primarily on trade to one focused on industrial extraction. During this period, Africa became a key target for European powers, including France, which sought to expand its colonial holdings across the continent. The French colonial empire grew significantly in North Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, with territories such as Algeria, Senegal, Mali, and the Ivory Coast falling under French control. At the heart of France's imperial ambitions was the ideology of the civilizing mission. The French justified their colonial actions by claiming they were bringing civilization, Christianity, and enlightenment to the supposedly backward peoples of Africa. However, this rhetoric was rooted in deeply racist ideas, which painted African societies as inferior and in need of European governance. French colonial policies were built upon these notions, and their colonial rule was marked by brutal repression, forced labor, and the destruction of African social and political structures. In the 19th century, Africa was seen as an invaluable source of raw materials for European industries. French colonial acquisitions were strategically important, not only for resource extraction, but also for securing trade routes. Territories along the African coast, such as Senegal and Madagascar, became critical for France's ambitions in the interior of the continent. The French exploited the vast natural resources of their colonies, including minerals, timber, and agricultural products, which were shipped back to Europe. This exploitation often took the form of forced labor, with African workers subjected to harsh conditions, and the economies of the colonies were restructured to serve the needs of the French metropole. By the early 20th century, the economic relationship between France and its colonies had solidified into a system of systemic underdevelopment. The French Empire was characterized by a policy of direct rule, which sought to eliminate traditional African power structures in favor of European-style governance. This was coupled with a system of economic exploitation that ensured the colonies would remain dependent on France for manufactured goods while providing the raw materials that fueled French industry. The economic exploitation of African colonies resulted in significant poverty and underdevelopment. Colonies were often required to produce single crops for export, which made their economies highly vulnerable to fluctuations in global markets. For example, in countries like Senegal and Ghana, groundnuts and cocoa became key exports, while in Uganda, cotton dominated. This system of monoculture created economies that were dependent on the whims of European markets and prevented the development of local industries. The borders of modern African states were largely shaped by the colonial partition of the continent, which disregarded the cultural and political realities of pre-colonial African societies. European powers drew arbitrary lines, creating new states that often grouped together diverse ethnic groups with no consideration for their existing political or social structures. The legacies of these arbitrary borders can still be seen today in the political and ethnic conflicts that plague many African countries. While the French Empire was vast, covering much of West and North Africa, it did not extend to the interior as much as the British Empire. Nonetheless, the French impact was deeply felt across the continent. French control of vast territories, such as Algeria and the Congo, was accompanied by policies that sought to extract maximum profit through the use of forced labor and other exploitative systems. French colonial authorities also suppressed local resistance to their rule, often using violence and coercion to maintain control. One of the most enduring legacies of French colonialism is the system of economic and political control known as France-Afrique. This system, which emerged in the early 1960s after many African countries gained independence, allowed France to maintain influence over its former colonies. Through a network of political, military and economic ties, France continued to exert control over its African possessions. The system relied on bribery, military presence, and the training of African elites in France. However, as the 21st century has progressed, France-Afrique has come under increasing pressure as African countries seek to diversify their international relations and reduce their dependence on France. The enduring effects of French colonialism are evident in the economic and political struggles faced by many African countries today. The legacy of underdevelopment, the artificial borders, and the exploitation of resources have all contributed to the ongoing challenges of poverty, conflict, and inequality in the region. The exploitation of Africa's resources, both human and material, by colonial powers like France, continues to shape the continent's development trajectory. Furthermore, the cultural plundering of Africa by colonial powers, including France, is another significant legacy. The theft of priceless cultural artifacts from Africa, many of which are held in French museums, has been a point of contention in post-colonial relations. Efforts to return these cultural treasures have been thwarted by the legal and political frameworks that protect the status quo of Western institutions, preventing the restitution of these stolen artifacts. In conclusion, France's colonial policy in Africa left a deep and lasting impact on the continent. Through the exploitation of African labor, resources, and culture, France built an empire that enriched the metropole at the expense of African development. While the colonial era has officially ended, The effects of French domination continue to be felt in the political, economic, and cultural spheres of modern Africa. As former colonies strive for independence and self-determination, they face the complex and enduring legacies of their colonial past. Diaspoint values your perspective and encourages you to share your thoughts on the topics we present. Feel free to comment and share with your network to spark broader discussions.